Hey everyone, I'm Shahem. So I'm recording this video after recording few videos for the IG demo playlist, and I realized I probably should have talked about some of the stuff I'm talking about in this video up front, um, to clarify some general issues with FHIR before you dive into the technical details. Um, So let's just go ahead and walk through these slides. There's no code here. I'm just going to read the various points I have in these slides and just talk through them. And I'm going to have to read through them myself with you to make sure I don't go off topic too much. All this will probably be covered in other videos, but I thought for this playlist, you really need to kind of hear this before you dive into the technical details. Okay. So, like the title of this slide, you really don't need to develop an IG for FHIR, okay? So the FHIR specification already gives you a base model, and that base model is all you need to actually capture your data, okay? IG development, with everything included in the IG, does not allow you to do more with the FHIR data model or the FHIR API, okay? It is actually about doing less, because you can stand a generic FHIR server to have a FHIR API, and you could push to it any data you like, as long as you do that within the shape and the model that the FHIR base specification specifies. And developing an IG doesn't really allow you to get outside of that model. That shape or that model. So it only eliminates things that you can put into that model. Okay, so keep this in mind. A IG, a profile, a code system, everything that you might be doing, except to logical models, and I'll briefly hint at that later, but for its intended use, for FHIR's intended use, which is data interoperability, the base specification is the most loose interoperability you could do. Anything past that is about doing less, not more. Anyone who tells you you can't do something with a FHIR server or with a FHIR API with a base specification, if that person says you need to define an extension before you could actually put your data in extension, they haven't learned FHIR enough yet. You don't need to define an extension to capture a data element that doesn't have a named field already for it. Defining an extension is about interoperability, but you could already put your data in. You don't need to define an extension. Okay, so let me see what I already kind of talked about here. So, like I said, it's about doing less, not more. When you define these things in an IG, you are defining validation rules for the data that could be coming through an API. And that allows the server or tooling to check the data as it goes in or comes out to see if that data is compliant with this validation rule that is in a profile, for example. If the data has a code that is not in a value set, that's wrong data. That gets possibly eliminated. So that's less, that's not more. Without a profile, anything could go through. Any infinite code. The specification doesn't specify codes in certain fields, so you could put whatever you want. Profile says what you should put in that field. It doesn't increase what you could put in the field. It just decreases. And again, if all you're trying to do is have a FHIR API as a database backend for your application, that is not the main goal of FHIR. That is not about data interoperability between two systems. FHIR is about two independent systems being able to exchange data and operate as if they are a single system. That's interoperability. It's about that. It's not about having a backend database for your application. You don't need FHIR for that. And if you want to use FHIR technology, that's fine. But you definitely don't need an IG for that. Your developers in your application already understand what's the data what's in the data, and they understand how to send the data back and forth. But if you want to enforce validation for your own application's sake, then yes, you could use FHIR to do that. And you could then define your validation, whatever you need. Like you don't want a field to be null, and the base specification allows you to make it null, then yes, you could write a profile to say this field cannot be null. And that will just forces your application not to mishandle its own data. But that's not the main use of FHIR. The long term, at least. In short term, you could do that, but in long term, it's really about interoperability between independent systems. Okay, and again, like I said, interoperability is about accommodating less data, not more data. Okay, specifically, the data we agreed on exchanging between our two systems. So these specific sets of codes, these specific fields need to have values and so forth. If we put in something in an extension, if that thing has a certain meaning, it has to go in this specific extension with that specific URL. You can't just arbitrarily put it in any kind of extension, because then the other side will just not have access to it. It will be invisible. Obviously, I'm assuming you understand this is all for computational interoperability. It's not meant for humans to look at these messages and figure out what's being exchanged, okay? That's why code is dumb. Code needs to look for specific values and has assumptions in it about what it finds when it goes to a certain field. It has an assumption about what it finds in that field. The profile that you write, basically you are writing the assumption for that code. So the code could say, okay, hey, check this value in this field against that profile and tell me if this field is holding the right value based on that profile. So the code doesn't have to figure that part out. The profile has the configuration information needed to validate the field. And I already said this. You can already do anything you want with a base FHIR model. Okay. And IGN content's about adding meaning where meaning is not defined or constrained enough in the base FHIR specification. And for most users of FHIR, it's about constraining. It's not about adding. Okay. So I briefly kind of already covered some of this. So there are common misconceptions about FHIR. One of them is I need to define an extension. And that's not, like I said, that's not really true. Defining extension is not a barrier. Having to define extension first is not necessary for you to actually represent your data with extensions. Okay, and the reason is because the extension with capital E, and I should have linked to this, I'll link it in the slide. It's basically a data type. It's a very simple data type, already part of the specification. It's a data type that stands for a key and a value, and this is a very common kind of representation of data. So you specify your key and you put your value in it. The key, to make sure that your key doesn't clash with someone else's system key, the data type that for the key is a URL. So you have to have a fully unique key to make sure that your key and your value doesn't clash with someone else's key and value. But you don't have to define an extension. There is a data type already defined. You just need to use that data type and put the key that you want and the value. And of course, the other system that's reading your data has to understand that it needs to look for the specific URL, which is the key, to find the value. That's where the agreement on the key is important, and that's where defining the extension is useful because it documents what is the key, and it allows tools then to look for that specific key. But that's for interoperability. It's not because you need to do that before you could actually use an API. You could use an API. You could actually test your data in API to learn about what keys you need first before you go on and define the profiles. So actually thinking about implementation guide before you generically play with a FHIR API is actually a bad thing, because you'll struggle more than less, because you try to find things before you understand how things work, and that's usually doesn't go well. Okay. So in addition to the extension data type that is available for you to use, effectively all FHIR data elements, by data elements I mean the various resources, and I assume you know some of them, and we'll cover that in more detail in other videos. the data types and all the named fields within the resources and the data types, okay, have a named field. All these things have a named field called extension with a small e, as opposed to a capital E extension data type. This extension is a list. It's an open list, unlimited list, that you could place instances of your extension data type in it. So the extension field with small e has a type extension with capital E. So you already have all the pieces you need. You have that field, that's a list, and you have the extension data type, and you could create 1 million extension instances to hold all the values you want with all the keys you want and put them in that extension field wherever you like, in any resource, in any data type, in any named field. You could attach this as an extension. So wherever you need to hang off your data in the FHIR model, you could do that for free. You don't need to create anything to be able to do that. The extension data type itself, with the extension with capital E, because it's a data type, itself has an extension field, which means you could put extensions on extensions, which means you could build a tree of extensions. And that's basically a data structure. Data structures are trees of fields and subfields and so forth. So JSON is a tree of objects, and you can represent any arbitrary JSON you want with nested extensions, starting from any extension field you like on any data element you like that's already defined in the basic data model, in the base FHIR data model. Okay, so I will have lots of examples of this later, but I just wanted to have this video in this playlist so you're aware of this upfront, because you might come to this playlist with some of these misconceptions that you might have heard from someone else, or you come from a background of, let's say, object-oriented modeling, where you're thinking, I have to define my class, I have to define the field in it before I could put the value. In FHIR, it's really different. Everything you need is already defined. If there's something that you need that's not defined, it goes under extension field, and you use extension data type for that. Okay, so the other thing, the other misconception, FHIR doesn't have the type I need, and by the type, usually mean either a data type or a resource type. So you don't find the word type used a lot in the FHIR documentation. Usually the word is resources. So resources are, when you see the word resource in the various places in the documentation, it's either referring to the type, for example, patient. The patient data structure is a type. And there actually is a field, which I will show later, a type field where you have to put a word in there to say what type it is. In addition to the idea of a profile, there's a type and a profile. So the base specification gives you data types and resource types, a hierarchy of them. And I'll show that later. But it also gives you one type that's called basic, with a capital B, and it's linked from here. And I don't want to get into this, but this is where you could actually define any type you want. It has its own way. You basically have to put the word that is your type, and then you build all the fields that you want for your type under the extension approach. So everything becomes an extension. Okay. So like I said, I already mentioned the field issue. So one other thing is FHIR doesn't have the field I need. So the solution is you add an extension instance. Let's say you have a value in some system, and you want to send it to a FHIR API, or you want to represent it in a FHIR message, and you can't find the right fields for it. You create an instance of extension, of the data type extension, and you find the extension field where you believe that value should kind of hang off or be close to the context where your value fits the best within the already defined structure in the FHIR structure. And so you just do that. So you create an extension instance, you find your extension field, you assign a key value, and then you put your value in the extension data type. And maybe it actually would help to look at really briefly here. And let me reduce my camera here. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I think it will help to look at the extension data type, just so you could see what that means. So if you come to, this is the home page, come to data types, and under the special purpose data types, there is the extension data type. It's documented in its own separate page, not in the long data type page, just because it's sort of a unique special data type, and you want to kind of read through this. But basically, you have the URL field, which is your key, and then your value field, and you hold your value in here. And like I said, the extension data type itself has an extension field inherited from the element data type. Okay, so you have an extension field under the extension data type, and you could nest extensions. We'll get into this in more detail, but you can't hold a value and add an extension at the same time. Just keep that in mind. And that sort of makes sense in common object-oriented kind of references and modeling. Okay. So not having a named field already in the base specification is not an issue. Not having a named type in the base specification is not an issue. You don't need to define extensions before you could use them. Okay, so what else do we have here? So FHIR is, I understand the issue with FHIR being difficult, but it's really not hard if you understand how to get started. It's really built from very few simple building blocks, okay, and with very simple principles. Just like the idea of a key and a value is very simple, but then when folks miss that simplicity and only hear about extensions and profiles, and then they get lost in the specification documentation, it looks intimidating. But if you can start at the right place and take the next step you need to take, and not get lost in the various content that's there, it's not hard. Okay, so like I said, there are there are very few simple building blocks, but out of those simple building blocks, there's a lot that's been built. And you could be overwhelmed with the amount of things that have been built, but how it's built is really, really simple. The principles, how it's built, is simple. But a lot has built because it addresses a lot of the problem that FHIR tries to address is complex, so it builds a lot of stuff to address that complexity. But you don't need to use it all, okay? And on the other hand, make sure you don't reinvent the wheel or work around what FHIR has already solved. And by solved, I mean at least framed the problem and the solution in a certain way. You want to find really, or get help, find the right place to get started in FHIR. Don't try to get overwhelmed with the amount and not search for where you should start, and then just go off and do your own thing. Okay, so like I said, the principles are simple. The amount of content is a lot. You need to take the time to learn what you need to learn before you focus on building a solution for the problem that you're trying to deal with. The other part that sort of makes it hard is it's still relatively new technology, relatively. So there is not a lot of enough documentation of it and so forth, and it's hard for someone who doesn't know the historic context and past development from which FHIR sort of evolved or is replacing. And specifically, if you're not familiar with HL7 and previous versions of interoperability solutions like version 3, version 2, and so forth, you'll see a lot in FHIR, but a lot of it comes from existing approaches and problems and abstract models. FHIR does it with the REST technology versus other previous technologies. And so it assumes that you have some background. Well, it doesn't assume. It's as it is right now, because there's a lack of enough easily accessible documentation, let's say, it assumes you at least know some of that background, and you understand all the other specifications that FHIR builds on, and you understand some modeling principles, technical modeling principles, and also like domain abstract modeling principles. And like I said, it assumes some technology, so it assumes you are maybe familiar with the rest. Well, you have to be familiar with the rest to kind of not have to learn the rest through FHIR. Just go learn the rest first and then come look at FHIR. It's probably going to be a lot easier that way. Technical formats like XML, JSON, and some understanding of how to work with a very loosely defined model. It's not abstract model. It's a concrete model, but it's loosely defined, and how you can use something that is loosely defined to address your problem. That's not always easy. And it has a modeling language in the specification, and that doesn't it's not obvious up front for newcomers. So I think if you have a good sense of what the modeling language is, things become a lot easier. Okay, so assume some of this for you to be able to do the work that you might need to do in FHIR. Okay, so here I have a slide, or maybe two, I can't remember. They're sort of personal opinions. It's based on kind of my own experience, so just take it or dismiss it as you like. You really need to understand the framework first. Your team really needs to do that. Stop just trying to search for the solution in FHIR. It's not like Google. You could go and search and find the perfect web page that gives you the answer that you need. Okay, so take the time, or plan on having time, to stop thinking about the problem you're trying to solve and just look at the framework. Or find someone who knows the framework and help them help you. Okay, don't make the learning piece a barrier to moving forward. Then you could build your solution from there. But what's even better, because FHIR is about interoperability, is try to find a partner or someone who is already dealing with the same problem and trying to address it in FHIR. And finding those partners is not always easy. You need to be involved in the community, go to the chat website and mailing lists and so forth, and just you have to network to find people doing the same thing, because whatever you come up with is more valuable if you do it with some other partner, because it's more likely going to be addressing interoperability between the two of you, rather than just a simple schema for your own application. And like I said, don't have, when you start with FHIR and you're new, don't have tunnel vision that I need to find the single perfect solution that FHIR gives me. It's not there. You're not going to find it. Okay. So FHIR never claimed to provide finished full solutions for specific use cases. Okay. So far, what it does, it just nudges you, okay, in a direction, in a technical and modeling direction, and only takes few steps to help you get started in that direction. Okay, but it doesn't have a finished product for you. That's for you to develop. And again, I want to kind of not give the wrong impression. You don't need to develop anything to use a FHIR API. So I know it's confusing. You don't need to develop anything to use an API. If you stand up a server and it's running, you could write code against that API to exchange any data you want. You don't need to develop anything further beyond that. So there are generic servers. You could run them, and I'll show one here soon in a video. And you could push any data you want through it. But if you want to define interoperability, you will be developing an IG, and that's work that you need to do. Okay. And also keep in mind that FHIR is a relatively new, and the keyword is relatively new. It's been going on for years, but it's still in the scope of this problem, it's relatively new. And in future versions, they will address additional requirements and give further guidance, and maybe provide more finished models and terminologies and all sorts of content for more use cases. Some of those might branch out into a separate IG. The specification already, and as I'll show later, in addition to defining the types, it also gives you a set of extensions that are recommended to use with those types. If you need something that is not in the type itself, there is an extension possibly for it in the specification. So you don't even need to define your own extension. And those are listed on a separate page, along with each of the data types and the resource types. And the base FHIR specification follows the 80-20 rule. You're probably not going to see a finished solution for your use case. And finished solution, I mean, let's say a named field under the patient resource, unless 80% of the users of FHIR will actually be using that field. Because if FHIR, if the base specification needs to have fields for everyone's possible use, you'll have thousands of fields in each type, and it just doesn't scale that way. So unless you think the problem that you're solving is going to be useful for 80% worldwide and 80% of the community, then your solution is for you to put in your own IG for your own community. It probably will not make it to the base specification. But if you have something that you know 80% of people need, you develop it, prototype it, and then you propose it to the base specification, and it will probably make it in there after some further feedback from the community. Okay, so again, these are opinions. If you naively dismiss FHIR for what it's intended for, okay, for interoperability, you'll be dismissing decades of knowledge and learned lessons. The HL7 community and the folks developing FHIR and the years of FHIR development itself is based on a lot of knowledge in this area. So you don't want to ignore it. If you want to do interoperability, you really need to look hard at FHIR and have a good reason not to go along with it. Because you'll be spending decades learning those same lessons all over again. And yes, you can solve, if you have a simple interoperability need, you can probably solve it between 2 systems, 3 systems that are willing to work together and define their own interoperability framework. If your interoperability needs are simple, yes, you could have a simple solution, simpler than FHIR, to actually get that working. Okay, but you'll really struggle with hard stuff. Hard stuff will be impossible to do. Okay, FHIR comes from a background where they've dealt with hard stuff. So yes, it does make simple things a little bit more difficult to do, but it makes hard things doable with the work it takes to do it. So that's there's lastly, I think this is the last slide. There are parts of FHIR framework, specifically the modeling language and the terminology approach, that are really powerful and useful, even if you're thinking about developing your own from scratch model for a REST API. But that is really not the intended use of the FHIR specification. But they had to develop this framework to develop the rest of FHIR. And they, like I said, they have a lot of knowledge and experience in this. So this modeling language is very rich, and it allows you to define a lot about your model and your data with that modeling language. And that basic modeling language is a very powerful framework for defining your own, let's say, from scratch APIs that have nothing to do with the FHIR resources and data types. All the FHIR resources and data types are defined with that modeling language. The word that's usually referred to this activity is logical models. So if you ever hear the word logical model in the documentation or in presentations, that is a reference to someone building a new type, either based on further specializing the types that are in FHIR, or you could go on and just build your own type hierarchy from scratch with no dependency on the FHIR type hierarchies. Okay, so that is the last slide, and I just thought it's important for you to kind of be aware of this while you're looking at the very tedious details in this playlist. You really don't need to do any of this work or learn anything I'm showing in this playlist if you just want to prototype some data exchange through a FHIR API. So Hope this is useful. I'm going to place this video in the playlist before the technical ones, so at least you hear this information, and then move on to see how to do less with FHIR, because every video after this is about how to do less with FHIR. Now, you use FHIR to define things, so you could exchange less data, but the data you exchange is correct. So again, keep this in mind. Developing on FHIR is about doing less with FHIR, not doing more. You could already do all you need to do without developing any profiles or extensions. Okay, see you on the next video. Please like and subscribe if you find these videos useful. It will encourage me to keep going, and leave a comment. Let me know what you're interested in next, and if there's anything I could do to improve the content or the quality of these videos. Also, at some point, check out some of these resources listed here. They're still work in progress, and I will have a follow-up video to describe them. Keep in mind that this content is for educational purposes. There are no guarantees of accuracy and completeness, and you should use at your own risk. You might be seeing a few YouTube cards on the screen. They're suggested next videos or related playlists.